Victor grumbled as he looked at the latest news about a sex scandal involving a high-ranking army general and one of his assistants, a married woman with 2 small children. The next story showed the now disgraced general telling reporters that it was a morally wrong decision on his part. He looked sullen and appeared significantly thinner than in some previously shown photos of him with his assistant, who was now also known to be his mistress. "It's funny how they all change hands and say some apologies after they've been caught," he told his wife of more than 30 years. He looked at Vanessa as he said this. They were in their living room, catching up on the news after dinner, as had been their habit for years. It was something they did together to spend some quiet time together, especially during the years when their children were growing up, and free time or us time was a very valuable resource. Now both of their children, James and Karen, were adults and had families of their own. James was 30 and an electrical engineer. He married his childhood sweetheart several years ago, and they had a 3-year-old daughter. Karen, who was 28, was the youngest and married a guy she met in her office. They had a 2-year-old son. Victor himself was 59 years old, and Vanessa was a couple of years younger than him. She has always been and remains a fitness freak, and that shows in her well-toned 5'8" body with big, juicy breasts and an ass that still turns heads. Of course, the effects of gravity and age were noticeable, but only barely noticeable. Her brown hair had just the right shade of white streaks that went well with her green eyes and cheerful face. And as far as Victor was concerned, his wife was one hot mommy and grandma. One look at his wife sitting next to him was enough to make something stir in his groin. He may have been almost 60, but regular long walks with Vanessa and power yoga classes helped keep his tool in good shape and performance. Some of his colleagues were already suffering from high blood pressure, high blood sugar, and related problems. He got lucky. Standing 6 feet tall, with silver gray hair and blue eyes, he looked more like a successful CEO than a retired technocrat. Victor looked at Vanessa lovingly. Her favorite series was about to start, and he moved closer to her and placed his right hand on her thigh. He knew her well. A little foreplay while watching her favorite TV series never failed to excite her. He might have a chance tonight. I'm guessing, like any other 2 consenting adults, they never thought they'd ever get caught, she replied, tossing her hair and keeping her green eyes glued to the TV screen. Victor turned back to watch the news. A retired military veteran appeared on screen, telling the world how difficult these constant overseas assignments are. Men have been away from the family for months on end, and, well, men will be men. His manner and presentation style left no doubt that his assistant, who was also married like him, was his only source of entertainment on an otherwise harsh and cold front. Do you think the absence of loved ones and loss of communication can be considered a genuine and forgivable reason for betrayal? Victor asked. He wasn't sure, but for a moment his wife's body seemed to tense and then relax. He gently stroked her thigh and was sure that his palm felt this sudden tension, but he could not be sure of the reason. She was silent for a minute or two, as if weighing her thoughts, and then replied, "We live in a society where same-sex marriage is no longer frowned upon. Couples live in open marriages. Cohabitation is not even worth discussing. In short, it's up to you people. It would be wrong for anyone else, including us, to express opinions on matters that are essentially personal." Victor digested his wife's answer. He seemed a little vague, answering without actually answering what he asked. By persons, did she mean only the man and woman involved in the affair, or perhaps also their relationship with their spouse or partner? Did she mean that cheating is acceptable if a couple is in an unhappy relationship with their partners and craves companionship with the opposite sex? Victor's mind had no time to process his wife's response as Vanessa at that moment changed her position and her legs opened attractively. Victor did not waste any time and moved his caressing hands closer to her panties. Vanessa's series was currently on TV, and she was completely engrossed in the unfolding plot. Victor began to kiss her juicy left breast through her light nightgown. Vanessa responded by pulling his face to her chest and running her fingers through his hair. This surprised him. as she usually only reached this level of excitement towards the end of her favorite series. Her hand went down into his boxers. They continued their caresses for a few more minutes until Vanessa breathed out her desire. "Let's have sex, Victor, right now," she whispered, breathing unevenly. Now Victor was completely surprised. This would be the first time they'd done it on the living room couch, even before the show had ended for the evening. But he wasn't complaining. By this point, the series was already forgotten. The next morning, Victor left early for the office of his former company. He stepped down as vice president several years ago. His company really didn't want him to leave. He had been with them for over 20 years, starting as a construction engineer and gradually rising through the ranks. But Victor was adamant. He discussed the issue with Vanessa before raising it with his company. With their children starting to work and start families, the two felt they needed more me time to meet their expanding families. Vanessa was also planning to resign in a couple of years. They finally agreed that he would continue to be associated with them as a consultant. The idea appealed to Victor as he could remain connected to the construction industry while his old company benefited from his extensive experience. According to the agreement, Victor visited the office 2 or 3 times a week, unless something important arose. This gave him enough free time to pursue his hobbies, namely golf. On the other hand, Vanessa held a senior position in the accounting department of a company that had a chain of retail stores throughout the state. She'd worked there for the last 10 years, ever since they moved from Dallas to Houston when he got promoted and had to move into the main office. In fact, the hard work she put in at her previous firm in Dallas and a glowing thank you note from her old boss, Harry Woolman, helped her land her new job. Harry knew the owners of the retail chain well, and when they decided to move to Houston, he contacted them and helped Vanessa get a job. Both were grateful to Harry for this. In Dallas, Vanessa got a job at Harry's company as soon as Karen was old enough to go to school and worked there from then until they moved to Houston, almost 14 years. The decision to move to Houston was not a big deal, since both of their children had graduated from high school and were off to college by then. Given her long association with his company, Harry made every effort to ensure that she got the job. There were times when Victor fondly recalled his years in Dallas. Both of their children were born and raised there, and sometimes he wanted them to settle there after they retired, but Vanessa wasn't interested. They were closer to their children and grandchildren in Houston, she reasoned, and that was more important than nostalgic memories of the past. It was better to live in the present than in the past, was her line of reasoning. Victor saw no reason to argue about this, and with the offer of counseling, it seemed like a perfectly acceptable choice. There were some more updates on the primetime news that evening about the fallen general and his mistress. Looking at the intense media coverage of the case, it seemed like it was the next best thing for the press after the sad and tragic events surrounding Lady Diana's death. According to the news anchor, the woman involved in the case told her friends that she regretted the harm her affair had caused her family and others. "You know," Victor said to his wife as she handed him his glass of wine, "she says she regrets the pain she caused her family, but she never mentioned that she regrets the affair. How can a woman, or, for that matter, a man, be so ambitious and completely focused on climbing the ladder? Career ladder? Has it never occurred to her that she is cheating and violating the trust placed in her by her husband? How can you be so sure that this affair was all about ambition and glamour?" Vanessa replied softly, sipping her wine. Victor was stunned by the answer. He looked sharply at his wife, who continued to stare at the TV screen. "This woman is not a 20-year-old naive girl at all, but a fully mature woman of 40. Do you mean that she consciously and deliberately decided to leave her marriage? You say that she developed feelings that should have been intended for her husband and rushed into a passionate affair, ignoring even her children and the consequences this could have on their future upbringing?" Victor asked incredulously. By this time, a news channel had shown some old footage of a woman doing push-ups with the person who was interviewing her. This was filmed at a time when the mistress released a book she wrote about her lover. It was a biography of a general. Of course, At that time, the world did not know that the general and the writer also slept together when they were not discussing the book. Victor, women and men think differently. Try to understand what I'm trying to say. If you ask women about their most cherished moment, most of them will tell you about a picnic or coffee in a bistro one rainy afternoon, but a guy will probably remember the different positions they had sex in after returning home from the bistro. Both were silent for a while as Victor tried to understand the gist of what his wife was trying to convey. Vanessa then continued. During the writing of the biography, they spent many months, if not years, together, and probably gradually developed a mutual connection, a coming together of two minds. And the bodies, too, Victor answered sharply. His wife seemed to justify the couple's actions in error. Vanessa pursed her lips as she heard her husband's outburst and continued to stare at the TV screen. This guy is old enough to play the role of grandfather to her young children. At the very least, he should have shown the maturity, which our leaders believed he had before appointing him to these important foreign posts, to make sure that mutual infatuation has not crossed all reasonable boundaries, Victor continued in a tone that he usually reserved for lectures to his younger colleagues. Ah, if only the heart could think and behave rationally, like the mind. It was a connection of hearts, fully realized by both, she whispered. Victor was amazed. He couldn't believe what he had just heard from his wife. The way she continued was like another episode of one of her maudlin soap operas. For the sake of her family and young children, if nothing else, I hope her husband sees her betrayal as much as you do, he replied irritably. There it is again. He was sure he felt her muscles tense at his words. She also sat up a little straighter. Perhaps he shouldn't have sounded so harsh, Victor thought. It seemed like they had unintentionally taken different sides here. He took the side of the deceived husband, while his wife took the side of the traitorous woman. Victor took the remote control and changed the channel. Over the next few days, Victor really had no time to follow the case of the fallen general and his married mistress. He and Vanessa were expecting their children and grandchildren to arrive for Thanksgiving, and Vanessa gave him a long to-do list. There were things to buy for the little ones who seemed to be in constant communication with their grandmother through their parents' cell phones. Then there was the precious china, which had to be carefully stored away in the attic. The idea was to give their grandchildren enough open space to run freely without bumping into anything expensive. Victor became so engrossed in his tasks that he decided to give up his golf game. Little did he know that his decision would change his life forever. He spent the day wrapping items from an expensive lunch set in soft fabrics and old newspapers, then placing them in cardboard boxes, which were then hauled up into the attic. Once he finished that, he started moving some other fragile items from the living room to the garage. He didn't hear the doorbell the first time because he was busy putting things in the garage. By the time he returned to the main house, the guy from the courier service had his finger on the bell button almost continuously. Victor looked around quickly before heading towards the front door. He still had a lot to do. "Are you the Browns?" the courier boy asked indifferently, moving the chewing gum from one side of his mouth to the other. "A package for you," he continued in the same spirit, handing the paper to Victor for signature. "These kids today just have no manners," Victor muttered, slamming the door. He placed the box on the kitchen table while trying to see who the sender was. It said his name, V. Brown, and it was from a law firm in Dallas. The fact that it was sent by someone from their old town piqued his curiosity. Perhaps if he hadn't been so busy, he would have realized that the initials V. Brown could also mean Vanessa Brown. Perhaps then he would have allowed Vanessa to open the package after she returned from work. But things were not like that. Victor took a kitchen knife and cut the packing tape. The sound of Vanessa's car pulling into their driveway in the evening broke the eerie silence that had reigned in the Brown house for the past few hours. This was followed by the sound of a car door opening and closing. Moments later, Vanessa entered the house through the garage door. "Hey, honey, I'm home," she called, busy rearranging several bags she was carrying along with her laptop bag. "Well, someone was busy today," she continued in a light tone, assessing the mess in the living room. "Honey, come down to my kitchen. I'm going to make us some really hot coffee," Vanessa said, heading into the kitchen. The fact that her husband still had not responded did not seem to arouse her curiosity. "Hey, what do we have here?" he heard his wife say. Victor looked down through red, puffy eyes at the photocopied paper he held in his now nearly numb hands. Until recently, they trembled uncontrollably. Victor clutched the piece of paper in his hands as if his life depended on it. He arranged the contents of the parcel just as he found it, with a letter from his wife's lover on top. He knew that was what she was probably looking at right now. Victor put on his glasses and began to read the letter again, knowing that his wife was probably doing the same. My dear beautiful Petal, if you hold this letter in your beautiful hands and read it, let me tell you, dear, that my time in this world has come to an end, and the Lord has commanded me to be in his heavenly abode. First of all, please, please don't grieve for me. I am an old man in my 70s, or rather I am a lonely old man in my 70s and have been so since the day Martha left so many years ago. Her departure to the Lord literally took away my desire to live. As you know, she was my childhood friend, and we married when we were just 20 and 19, so she was there for me through good times and bad for almost 40 years until illness and disease slowly took her life. She knew she was leaving, and so did I, but until the very end we held on to each other like two teenagers, appreciating every moment, every precious moment we could still share, until finally it was time for her to leave. So, like I just said, please don't grieve for me. In fact, it's time to reunite with my girlfriend. My children are well settled, and even my grandchildren are now ready to fly out of the nest. So, my lovely Petal, say goodbye to me with a smile, the old man. If there is life after death, then it's time to start over and find out where my Martha is. And to you, my lovely Petal, if it had not been for your loving care and kindness in those terrible days after my Martha left me alone and helpless, like a piece of dead wood floating on the ocean tossed to and fro by the waves and currents, I would long gone. Do not argue. I know it's true, and so do you. You took me under your loving care, comforting me as a mother would comfort a grieving child. The warmth of your love and our closeness acted like a magic potion. You know, the truth is that I've always had a soft spot for you, despite the age difference. Whether it's watching you at work or how busy you are during kids' parties, I've always felt a strong affection for you. Perhaps in many ways you reminded me of my younger years when my children were at home and Martha and I were busy to the limit. Those special touches and playful whispers that you girls gossiped and laughed about at work were actually meant only for you. I only said these things to other girls to cover my tracks. It seemed to work, because when you, girls at work, were exchanging opinions, my prank always stood out, and you all laughed at it as if it were senile dementia. And then, when I was left alone in this world, I saw another side of you, caring and loving. Have you ever wondered what the symbol of femininity symbolizes? Well, let me tell you. The circle represents spirit, and the cross represents matter. And you, my dear Vanessa, are the epitome of femininity. You brought this mortally wounded soul back to life, giving it a reason to exist. If Martha is looking at me now as I write these last words to you, I'm sure she completely agrees. And the physical intimacy you shared with me, it was fantastic. You were always so lively, full of energy and pranks. Even the Playboy girls could learn a thing or two from you. In short, you are the epitome of femininity, in spirit, in mind, and definitely in body too. May the Lord fill every minute and second of your life with happiness and good health. You love children, and I hope the Lord will give you many more cute babies. Well, beautiful Petal, I take great pains to express my eternal gratitude to you. Let me get to the main reasons why I am writing this letter. You may have already guessed the first reason by looking at the stack of photographs and CDs attached to this letter in the parcel. Yes, you guessed right. These are memories of our communication. I apologize for this voyeuristic side of me, but you know me so well that you probably already knew about it, although you never said it. Well, I had cameras strategically placed in my office and home. But rest assured, I have never shared these memories of our interaction with anyone, not even with some of the women with whom I shared friendship. This is also at your request, and you know about all of them. With my end approaching, I couldn't bring myself to burn them, so I'm sending them to you. Please keep them close to your heart forever, just like I do. And now about another reason. Honey, my lawyers will be contacting you shortly regarding the $2 million check made out to you. Do you remember our 2-day trip to Miami? We set out to sea from the port and lived completely naked under the open blue sky. This is one trip I regret not taking my trail camera with. We snorkeled naked, then spent a lazy afternoon making love on the open deck. Then we cooked dinner, got drunk, and made love again in the living area. These were great moments we shared together. You may also remember that on the last day we visited an art gallery and you chose a few paintings. Well, my lovely petal, they are now valued at about a couple of $1 million, and I don't think I should pass them on to any of my children. I have instructed my lawyers to sell them at a fair price and send all the proceeds to you. If you wish, you can send your bank details to my lawyer, and he will transfer them to your account electronically. Well, it seems I said everything I wanted. My dear lovely petal, I wish you all the best in life again. Take care of yourself. Forever indebted to you, Peachy. The letter slipped from his lifeless fingers and landed at his feet. The letter left little to the imagination. His wife had an affair with her boss in Dallas for over 30 years, and he never even suspected that anything was wrong. An incident from the distant past came to mind. Harry and Martha were partygoers and threw them often. Like all previous parties, this one was also at the highest level. It was late, and he started looking for his wife, as she had been drinking a lot, and he didn't want to get in trouble while driving home. She was not in the living room or kitchen. He walked out onto the patio and stopped. His wife was with her boss, in one dark corner of the patio. Harry put his arm around her waist and pulled her towards him. He leaned towards her and seemed to whisper in her ear. Vanessa, as far as he could tell, didn't mind the intimacy and was smiling. Since it was dark and they were a little out of the way, he wasn't sure, but it seemed like Harry's hips were moving as if he was dryly fucking his wife. He didn't like it at all. His foot must have hit something because upon hearing the sound, Harry immediately retreated a fair distance away. Victor approached them and spoke as if he had not noticed anything. His wife, he noticed, was blushing, and it was definitely not from the drink. Later in the car, he let her know that he thought he had seen it and asked her for confirmation. Although she didn't directly deny anything, she brushed off his suspicions by saying that Harry was cavalier with almost all the girls, especially after a couple of drinks. With all due respect to Martha, one look at her is enough to understand why he behaves like that at parties. His wife said that night with a mischievous smile. Either way, she assured him that she could handle it. They had a wonderful time in bed that night, and by the next morning, all of Victor's doubts were forgotten, at least until now. Victor remembered Martha. She always wore her hair short and probably looked a lot like the wife of that general who had been in the news lately for reasons other than military victories. His service certainly didn't involve taking down foreign terrorists, but he certainly accomplished something much juicier. The same way Harry won his wife. He picked up his smartphone and began scrolling through the photos he had scanned and downloaded onto his laptop as well as his cell phone. The photographs showed them having sex in the office. Harry usually took off his trousers and boxers in his office for their quick lunch meetings, as shown by the time on the wall clock. In one photo, Harry leaned back in his office chair while his wife played between his legs. He closed his eyes while Vanessa seemed to look at him with a fascinated expression. Another photo showed her with her blouse and bra pulled up. The next photo disgusted him. His wife was, again, without her top. Her face was sticky. They both laughed. When he touched the screen of his smartphone to enlarge the image, he noticed a date on the table. This was about 6 months after Martha's death and a year before they moved to Houston. Martha was diagnosed with liver cancer. The excess partying had finally taken its toll on her. The diagnosis was made too late, and the cancer was at an advanced stage. She died 6 months later. Her death changed Harry. As far as Victor could remember, they didn't attend any more parties at his house after that, but by then he had already begun an affair with his wife. He really no longer needed to throw parties to dryly have his wife. They continued to have sex with each other for almost a year, and he didn't even know it. He felt his chest tighten and bile rise to his throat. He was a cuckold, just like that doctor in the story of the fall of the general. What does the general's wife think now? Victor thought. She was humiliated in front of the public by the very man for whose family she selflessly sacrificed everything. For more than 30 years, she stood like a shadow behind him, supporting him in accepting the most difficult assignments on behalf of the country, fully aware of the difficulties that she and their family would have to face. What is she thinking about now? He repeated to himself, as if the answer to his pain and humiliation lay in her thoughts and actions. She was the same age as him, and at their age one expects a simple life after retirement, grandchildren, and watching the sun set in the west in the company of his partner. The last thing he thought about was betrayal by his husband and its consequences, his pain and humiliation. The general's wife selflessly served her family, and this was reflected in her appearance. She certainly couldn't compete with the mother of 2 young children, who was probably enjoying the postpartum glow and beauty that comes with having a baby. And the cuckold, what does he think? He thought that his wife was traveling around the world to put the finishing touches on the biography of one of their nation's greatest soldiers. But now it seems that she has also been pinned down by him in various places and locations around the world. He chuckled to himself, realizing that he was not alone in his hour of deception and pain. Before he could decide to go to the bathroom, he heard soft footsteps approaching his office. He wiped away his tears and tried to suppress the urge to vomit. He might be a cuckold, but he wasn't going to let his cheating wife see the humiliation on his face. He put on his glasses and bravely turned to the door of his office. The door opened quietly and Vanessa walked in, as if on tiptoe. She stood silently, looking at him. Victor stared back, trying his best not to blink or shed a tear. The bile was still somewhere in his mouth. He could smell her bitter scent. He took a deep breath and counted down to 10 before speaking. The package was addressed to V. Brown and was from Dallas, so I mistakenly assumed it was for me, he said as firmly as he could. She cried. Her makeup was completely ruined by the tears that ran down her face, and her neatly styled hair looked disheveled, as if she had just gotten out of bed and walked straight into the office. She nodded her head and sat down on the only other chair in the office, located opposite him and a little further away. He continued to look at his wife. In turn, she would occasionally glance at him and then stare back at the wall behind his shoulder, as if it contained some vital hidden hieroglyphs that could help them overcome their current crisis. What should you tell your wife of over 30 years? What should a mature man of almost 60 say to his cheating wife? Together they saw life, all its surprises and all its ups and downs. He was old and would not live forever. Such is the course of nature. The next generation, their grandchildren, have already arrived in this world to continue their lineage after they become just memories. So what should a grandmother tell her grandchildren? How should he make excuses for the insult and humiliation that were heaped upon him? Why did she kill him without killing him? Why? Victor, This may sound corny, but it's not what you think, she began nervously, and then stopped because her words failed her. Not what I think? Is that all she has in defense? 8 years later, a mature 40-something woman is cheating on her husband, her family, and her commitments, and now she says it's not what I think it is in her defense. For almost a year. This was not a casual one-night stand. It lasted for many months. In one of the scenes on the CD, his wife was dressed as a Playboy bunny with a tight corset and only a bright red thong covering her womanhood. As the CD played, he saw Harry having sex with her. He watched them copulate for several minutes before turning away in shame and humiliation. But Harry was still in business. The old man had stamina, that's for sure. Victor had never felt so bad and humiliated, and perhaps it showed on his face because he could see his wife cringing and moving back in her chair, guilty of something he had never suspected before. At least that doctor on the news didn't have a CD to watch his wife having sex with the general, he thought bitterly. Images of his wife dressed like a Playboy bunny, her eyes wide with pleasure, and her big, luscious breasts just wouldn't go away in his mind. There were other clips, no less erotic. The old man had really good recording techniques. He wondered if the general had also made CDs of his mistress in various locations around the world. This was not intentional or planned. After Martha died, we noticed at work that Harry had lost control of himself. His death devastated him. Vanessa began, in her second attempt, to start a reasonable dialogue between them. Victor nodded in agreement. He knew this, as did many others who knew Harry. Everything happened so quickly. 6 months after the diagnosis, Martha left. During those 6 months, Harry changed doctors, sent her to bigger and better medical schools. But even the best of doctors could not prevent the inevitable. He remembered Vanessa telling him how they would leave some documents on the table for him, and when they would return later, they would find them untouched, and Harry would just sit there, staring at his laptop screen. At their insistence, he visited doctors who prescribed him some sedatives. It was as if he had lost the will to live. The medications prescribed by the doctors helped. He began to show interest again. At the same time, we at work also tried to be around him as often as possible. The idea was to keep his mind busy with work issues so that he wouldn't have time to start thinking about his loss. But it soon became apparent that while he acknowledged our concern for him and certainly did his best, he simply wasn't there for us. The problem was that, as head of the business, Harry was also our chief negotiator. He was good at it, but now it seemed that he was losing his skill. Like I said, he just seemed like he wasn't here, Vanessa said. Victor looked at his wife's unkempt face. Everything she had just said was generally known to him in those days, but he could not understand how it related to her betrayal. That's when some of the senior members of the company had a small meeting with Harry. It was decided that he would have an assistant from the company for these important meetings with clients, Vanessa said. She paused to see how her husband was taking it all. Victor looked at her questioningly. He wondered where this was all going. "I've been assigned as Harry's assistant," Vanessa continued. When she said these lines, Vanessa looked at her husband with a look, what? Protective, but at the same time, defiant. Victor leaned forward, his interest piqued. "I made it my mission to make sure Harry had all the information he needed from all departments for any upcoming meeting. This required a lot of communication with department heads and their staff. It also required me to develop some understanding of the work being done across all departments. By this time, Harry started to become more and more involved. This was a good sign for us. He then taught me the functioning of some departments and the basic but necessary parameters that I had to ask about and provide. Things started to come together and the business began to improve. We worked as a team. I started accompanying him to all his client meetings, even business trips," she continued, looking at her husband warily when she mentioned business trips. By this point, Victor began to understand some things, but did not interrupt his wife, preferring to let her tell her side of the story. Eventually, I almost completely took over as his de facto chief advisor. Business began to improve, and we were able to stop the decline in sales. In fact, I felt it was my duty to make sure that he did not miss his medications. His complete dependence on me was obvious for everyone, and it made me proud that I was able to pull the company back from the brink. Vanessa continued with barely concealed pride on her face, her eyes having a distant look as she recalled past events. Victor continued to watch his wife, but with a more intense gaze. The bile once again threatened to ruin the calm look on his face, and the intense tightening returned to his chest. His analytical technocratic mind had already understood a lot and was far ahead of the unfolding plot between flashes of tears and sobs. "So you became his concubine," he protested loudly, recalling one of the terms the press generously used to describe the fallen mistress of a married general. Vanessa recoiled as if she had been hit hard. Her face turned scarlet from the insult and anger flared from her wide eyes. "Don't you dare call me that," she said angrily. She wrapped her arms around her chest and breathed heavily. Victor looked at her with interest. He began to wonder how his wife saw herself and the selfless service she had provided. Names? Of course not. How could you think of that? In Roman times, a concubine enjoyed almost the same rights as a wife. In fact, the word concubine was even engraved on tombstones. Of course, a man was considered dishonest if a concubine entered into a relationship with another man, Victor retorted. He seemed to enjoy the discomfort his wife was experiencing. Even the bile seemed to no longer threaten him so much. The silent confrontation between them continued until she finally said, "I was not a concubine." "Continue," Victor replied wearily. "As I said, Harry became almost completely dependent on me. From the moment he came into the office until the moment he left, he was with me. It also helped improve my negotiation skills by watching Harry and also through the advice that he gave me from time to time." Vanessa fell silent, as if collecting her thoughts. The real story begins now, Victor thought gloomily. But he was still a lost soul. Sometimes when we were having dinner at a hotel restaurant during our business trips with clients, he would look at the couples at the next tables with a nostalgic but sad look. And then one day, when we were slow dancing and getting close, he pressed himself against me. I realized that he was excited. I looked at him with embarrassment and realized that he was looking at a very cute couple on the dance floor. There was silence for a moment. Victor saw that his wife was gathering the strength to continue. "Continue," he said dryly. "Well, when we got back to my room, I invited him over for one last cocktail, and that's how it all started," she finished, once again refusing to meet her husband's gaze. By this point, the feeling of betrayal and humiliation had given way to anger. If what he heard was true, then it was at that moment that their connection began. They were definitely in no hurry to move on to sex, Victor thought, looking at his wife. As he remembered, the general and his mistress also sang a similar song, that nothing happened during their travels together, but everything began when everyone returned to their homes. "So you two had sex? No, let's just say made love. That night for the first time," Victor said, heavy sarcasm evident in his voice. "No, no, Victor, I didn't make love to Harry. Lord knows the only person I love is you and only you," she objected. It was healing of mind and body. Victor began to feel uncomfortable. The way his wife responded made him feel like he had never really known his wife in over 30 years. They say that a man can never truly know a woman completely. Only now did he begin to understand the full meaning of this. What he realized that she was going to tell him next was that they slept together that night, and it was, to say the least, having sex. And considering that it went on for almost a year, it was more like making love because there were feelings involved. But his wife, who was the head of the accounting department of a large division and had more than 50 years of world experience, seemed to be in denial about all this. What were they doing in the hotel room? Have you played Pinky Pinky? After a couple of cocktails and talking about everything under the sun, but nothing in particular, I leaned over and kissed him on the lips. He seemed surprised at first, but then kissed him back. After some kissing and caressing, I unbuttoned my blouse and I let it fall to the floor along with my bra. I told him that Mommy wants him to drink her milk tonight. "What are you talking about?" cried Victor. "Please, Victor, I'm trying to be as honest with you as possible," Vanessa whispered. Fresh tears had already begun to make their way down her pale face. Harry was all over me. He pressed me and started playing with my breasts, caressing them, kissing them, and all the time praising my beauty. It was funny to hear him sing my praises, and he turned me on too. Then he reached for my skirt and I stopped his hand. Instead, I unbuttoned his pants and satisfied him. That's it, finally. His wife finally told him how their affair began. Did the general's affair begin just as innocently? The two were discussing a draft of his biography, and one day they just put the book aside and started having sex with each other. He wondered what story her husband was telling now. Now that the cards are on the table, it seems that the family she rejected for the general's embrace and bed seems to be the only one who can offer her refuge and protection in these times of national, if not international, shame and humiliation. The next morning, Harry met me at breakfast. A completely new Harry, more like the old Harry. We didn't talk about our date the night before, but it weighed on me. Seeing the sparkle in his eyes and the smile on his face, I was convinced that I had made the right decision the day before. The right decision? Of course, you didn't think to discuss this with me before doing it. Or perhaps you assumed that I would fully support your method of bringing your boss back to life, Victor retorted bitterly. Vanessa looked at her husband in surprise before continuing. The next few days in the office were uneventful. Harry had changed for the better, and I was happy. We continued to work closely and have lunch together in his office. Then one day when I walked into his office, he asked me to lock the door and come up. When I approached him, I saw that he had taken off his trousers and underpants. He was sitting naked. He looked at me with that look in his eyes that he had that evening in the restaurant. I discovered I would unbutton my blouse and kneel in front of him. It became almost a daily routine. I just couldn't bring myself to refuse him. You couldn't refuse, repeated Victor incredulously. Victor, this man suffered a terrible tragedy, Vanessa retorted almost desperately. She is not my wife. This is not the woman I married, Victor repeated to himself. But the photos and CDs show you doing so much more than just pleasuring each other, Victor replied. Victor, I'm sorry for the pain and suffering that I put on you. Watching those clips must have been terrible. Oh God, if I only knew. Vanessa trailed off, grief and anguish written all over her face. Fresh tears made new paths down her cheeks as they flowed down. Vanessa lowered her head and continued to sob quietly. Victor looked at his sobbing wife. Her suffering seemed sincere. 30 years of marriage ensured that the spouses could read each other. But why? Why did she arrange this connection? Was he not good enough? Could he not satisfy her? So, just for the record, when did you two finally start cuckolding me in the fullest sense of the word? Victor asked her sharply. Vanessa flinched when she heard his words. She started to say something, then stopped. She then spoke again, keeping her eyes glued to the floor the entire time. Harry and I were spending our lunch breaks together almost every day by then. Since I had been chosen by the company to be Harry's assistant, no one saw anything wrong with it, so I spent time at lunch with him. And Harry? Well, let me say that by then he had returned to his old style of communicating with people. Gone was the picture of Harry walking with his shoulders slumped and heading straight to his office, not noticing anyone. Victor couldn't help but notice the pride in her tone as she said those words. We were at one of those client meetings out of town. Harry was at his best and the meeting went well. That evening we decided to have a little party just for us. Needless to say, we drank and danced a lot and, to make a long story short, had a good time. Harry seemed to be himself and didn't miss a chance to cuddle around on the dance floor. Then he leaned over to me and whispered that we should go up to my room for one last cocktail. Well, I realized what he really meant, and, well, we already did this regularly, so I agreed. We left the restaurant and headed to the elevators. Once we were in my room, I went to the bathroom. When I returned, I saw that Harry had completely undressed and was lying on the bed. I joined him, Vanessa whispered again. She definitely joined him, thought Victor. The bile once again threatened to destroy the facade of calm he had so desperately clung to. Some of the images he had seen in the clips flashed through his mind. Victor watched with tears in his eyes as his wife had wild sex with her lover. Victor, with disgust, watched these clips. Vanessa's eyes opened wide as she covered her mouth with her hand, a look of shock and shame on her face. Sorry, Victor. I feel sorry for you. Tell me, Vanessa, as far as I remember those past years, you really didn't travel that much, but yet, judging by the CD recording, it seems like you two just couldn't keep their hands off each other. So all the cuckolding took place at his house as shown on the CDs? His wife flinched when he said the C word. At least she still had a lot of decency left in her, Victor thought. She spoke again, her face turned to the side, her eyes refusing to meet his. We had his place all to ourselves. His son served in the army and was overseas, and his daughter moved to New York. Harry left the office early and no one really minded. Then I left early too, with some papers that Harry would look on the way home. Since I was his appointed assistant, this did not raise any suspicions, Vanessa replied, speaking the last few words in a quiet whisper. Yes, you're right. It definitely didn't occur to me to ask you why you stopped at his house so often on the way home. You're right. It definitely didn't occur to me to ask why you stopped at his house so often on the way back. And then I moved to Houston, and the way was open for you to cheat on me freely. How naive of me, Victor replied sharply. Vanessa did not look in his direction, although her flushed face and labored breathing clearly showed that he crossed the interrogation, and the answers confused her. Vanessa didn't answer. Instead, she continued to look at her hands in her lap. Victor struggled with his feelings and then asked, "Why did you do that?" "We were losing him. After Martha died, it seemed that he had lost the will to live. He was lost and alone, like a lamb lost in the forest." "Tell me, Victor, is it bad to save someone from death?" "You're a married woman and you slept with your boss," Victor retorted sharply. He didn't seem to know his wife at all. "Victor, suppose you and that big-breasted Anderson woman who lives down the street got lost in a snowstorm and ended up in an old wooden cabin, and to keep warm, you hugged each other and maybe... If we had sex, would that mean you cheated on me?" "What a strange argument, Vanessa," Victor exclaimed loudly. It seemed that they were tuned to completely different waves, and what one thought and said, the other could not catch. "What I want to say is that I loved you and only you, Victor, and what happened between me and Harry was exactly as you saw it. Just sex. Sex for the sake of getting back the person we all knew, from the world of the living dead. I don't care whether your lover lives or dies. I should have these feelings and emotions, and only I. If sex is some kind of medical therapy, as you imagine it, then all the nurses in all the damn hospitals should be doing this with enthusiasm," Victor shouted in rage. With that final outburst, Victor left the room. He gathered his things for the night from the bedroom and made himself comfortable in the guest room. That night, he couldn't sleep. His confrontation with his wife over her affair led to some startling information, a new insight into his wife's personality that left him feeling uneasy. Throughout their confrontation, she maintained that it was not an affair, but rather some form of therapy, and that he was and always would be her true love. What nonsense was that? Or is this a new way to justify your relationship? I wonder if the general's mistress said similar things to her deceived husband. What could she say? That she felt sorry for the lonely general, so far from her family. And what if she hadn't opened her legs for him? The free world would have lost one of its best defenders? Would the deceived doctor believe her? Why should he? After all, the skeletons only came out of the closet when a government agency accidentally stumbled upon their well-hidden secret while investigating another case. Besides, the general and his married mistress came out quite clean. Also, if he had not opened the courier package, he would never have known about his wife's relationship with her boss. Even the best-laid plans of mice and men often go awry, Victor thought bitterly. Vanessa knocked on the guest room door and asked if he had taken his medications. Victor snorted and turned his back to the door, not bothering to answer. She may have considered herself an expert in therapy, but he didn't need her to remind him. Vanessa knocked on the door a couple more times, and then everything went quiet. Victor felt a drop of guilt. His wife always kept track of his medications, and a small voice inside him reproached him for such childish behavior. Thank God the children had all grown up and flown the nest. Perhaps that was one of the last thoughts swirling through his shaken mind before sleep finally overcame him. They spent the next couple of days trying to avoid each other. Victor was still trying to fully process the fact that his wife had cheated on him. What was even more annoying was that she really didn't see anything wrong with it. It seemed like she had done what she thought was necessary and that was it. And they had to move on with their lives. Thanksgiving was close, and soon their children and grandchildren would be here, and there was still a lot of preparation. There was, as it were, an unspoken truce agreement between them until the children went home. Victor went about his daily business, trying to talk to his wife as little as possible. Vanessa seemed to understand her husband's desire to maintain distance and silence, but her eyes often became red and swollen, and her face took on a constantly sick hue. Often he caught her looking at him, and yes, they no longer watched the evening news after dinner. This may have been the first direct victim of her long-term affair. It didn't escape his wife's notice either, because after dinner he was now heading straight to the guest room, while Vanessa remained in the kitchen for a long time afterwards, drink in hand. He wondered how things were going for the deceived doctor and his cheating wife. Is he also sleeping in the guest room now that the whole world knows that the general has taken his side of the bed for himself? The day before the children arrived, Vanessa begged Victor to return to the master bedroom. Victor initially refused, but then later gave in. He saw no reason to demonstrate his humiliation and betrayal in front of his grown children and their spouses. Nothing good will come of this. Finally, the children arrived home, and for a while all the sorrows were forgotten or put aside. He hadn't seen his children for almost 6 months, and it was nice to see them again. It was even better to hear and see the grandchildren running around the house. Karen was the first to notice the changes in her mother. It's amazing how girls can pick up on even the smallest changes in behavior and mannerisms. "Mom, you seem out of sorts. I hope you get regular checkups," she said with concern in her voice. Karen has always had a caring side to her nature. Trust her to notice the hidden currents of raw emotion. "Hey, Dad. I hope you and Mom weren't fighting over something stupid like little kids," she continued. This was said in a light tone, but Vanessa sat up straight and stared at her daughter's back. She had the look of a deer caught in headlights. "Hey, look, it's that cuckold and the general's concubine," James suddenly shouted. All this time he was glued to the TV, not paying attention to what his sister was saying. Now it was Victor's turn to be shocked. Until that moment, no one else in the house had used the word cuckold except him. Hearing his own son shout, it made him lose his composure for a moment. Victor turned quickly to see his son watching the news on TV. The news channel showed the cheated doctor and his cheating wife walking together on a gravel path outside their friend's house, where they planned to spend the Thanksgiving holiday. The woman put on dark glasses and turned up the collar of her coat, apparently to protect herself from the cold wind and unwanted cameras. Victor remembered seeing her earlier on the same TV channel in more fashionable outfits. The fine lines around her mouth were clearly visible. Cheating is one thing, but being caught cheating by the world's media is a completely different matter. Victor looked at his wife furtively. She stood in the same place where he saw her a few seconds ago. She seemed to be paralyzed from head to toe. The deathly pale face returned, as did the pain in his chest. The painful memories of the past few days and the cruel images of his wife's betrayal in the photographs and CDs sent by her lover as a final gift flashed back before his eyes. Why? Why the hell? Why did she cheat on her family after taking her marriage vows and entering into family life? Didn't she understand that her life no longer belonged to her alone, just as his life no longer belonged to him alone? Why? Goddamn it. But she did not seem to be a unique woman. This woman on the news definitely belonged to her club. Her husband looked so different from the devil general. The deceived man was a professional, a doctor by profession, a lifesaver, and it showed in his manner. It was a shame that his wife chose soldiers, one of whom had just caused collateral damage to her family, forever changing the sweet innocence of 2 young children who didn't even realize how adults were playing with their lives. "Oh, these kids are so cute," Karen exclaimed, her maternal instincts once again at play. One look at this homely cuckold and the whole world can understand why his wife replaced him with a brave general, said James, completely engrossed in the news. "Come on, James. We don't know the whole story, do we?" Perhaps she felt that the general, entrusted by the free world with the task of spreading their ideas and thoughts to an undeveloped and wild part of the world, needed the support of a friend, a good friend, since he was so far away from his family and loved ones. Perhaps some would say that the doctor shouldn't worry about it and continue living his so-called happy life, Victor countered, carefully watching his wife at the same time. My lucky leg. The doctor has been humiliated enough. The woman is very ambitious, and I'm sure this is not the first or last time she will spread her legs to achieve what she wants. If the doctor is smart enough, he will cut his losses as soon as possible and move on. Of course, he should also take the children with him because the woman has not an ounce of kindness in her soul. The doctor took care of his children and served his patients while his wife had sex with her lover all over the world. No, Lord, she is bad woman, and he needs to cut her out of his life as soon as the media frenzy dies down. But first of all, he needs to test the DNA of his children. James finished decisively. My thoughts are exactly the same, Victor thought. He then looked briefly at his wife. She still stood frozen, holding on to the back of the chair in front of her, as if her life depended on it. She may have been startled by her son's sudden outburst of emotion. The pupils of her eyes jumped from one family member to another and back again. She may have developed feelings for the general over a long period of association that lasted for years. There is no doubt that she is a very strong and ambitious woman, as can be seen from her school and West Point records, which the press has so kindly dug up for their dear readers. Perhaps, as their communication with the general continued, she saw her ideal man in him, Karen reasoned. She seemed to be in the same position as her mother, Victor thought. Do all women think the same? No way, Karen, said Janet, Victor's sister-in-law, who had just joined them after checking on the kids. She is obligated in a relationship called marriage and has a family of her own. Even if she had developed some feelings for another man, she should not have crossed that invisible line. She selfishly violated the trust and faith placed in her by her family. In that sense, she has, in a way, already left them and moved on in her personal life, where there is little room for her family, and certainly nothing for the father of her children. The family needs to move on too, Janet continued. Wow, thought Victor. At least one woman in his house had a different opinion. His son was the lucky one. He had a good life partner in Janet. His daughter-in-law was a smart woman. Opinion was now split 2-1. Victor turned to his wife. So, darling, what do you say to that? Was it a love story that should have been brought to life, as Karen thinks, or should it have remained just a love story, as Janet thinks? All eyes in the room turned to her. She stood there with her eyes wide open, her lips trembling, and her mouth forming a small O. She basically looked like a cornered animal, with a gun pointed right between her eyes. Just leave them alone, she suddenly screamed, causing everyone present to flinch in surprise. Tears were already streaming down her cheeks, ruining her makeup irrevocably. Why the hell do you care what they do or don't do? She continued in a trembling voice. She was also visibly shaking, the dim light in the room casting strange shadows on her face. Mother! Exclaimed Karen with alarm. She was about to approach her mother, but Vanessa stopped her with an outstretched hand and then quickly walked away, leaving everyone in amazement. Karen's husband, Dave, came in from the patio. He was talking on his cell phone the whole time and missed the family drama. Hey, I heard loud voices. What happened? He asked curiously. Nothing, Dave. I hope nothing, Karen replied softly, still looking at the door her mother had just left through. Now her maternal instincts were fully activated, and she felt that something was wrong. She then turned to look at her father with an unspoken question in her eyes. Victor assumed a neutral expression and shrugged. The next day, no one talked about the general and his concubine or the near-nervous breakdown that Vanessa seemed to have suffered. The children and their spouses, as well as the grandchildren, said goodbye, and by late evening, Victor and Vanessa were left alone. In another time, they might have found themselves in the bathroom, completely naked and sharing a glass of wine. But now, there was nothing in common, except even more awkward questions and even more denials. Vanessa's eyes were puffy and red, and she seemed to have lost some weight in the last 2 weeks since the courier package arrived. But her behavior continued to be a mystery to Victor. Without much on his mind, Victor pulled out a bottle of his favorite whiskey and poured himself a large drink. By late evening, the bottle lay next to him on the sofa, almost empty. He sat staring through his alcoholic intoxication at the TV screen. Vanessa was also in the room and looked at him with disapproval, but wisely remained silent. Victor didn't care whether she approved of his drinking or not. After all, she didn't ask his opinion before spreading her legs for her boss. The news showed photographs of the general's mistress taken in some remote, undeveloped Asian country. She pulled a scarf over her head to cover her hair as she stood among a group of smiling local children. Victor thought it was funny. Why did she cover her head with a scarf? He muttered through his drunkenness. According to the norms of the society of that country, a woman should keep her head covered. So that's what she does, Vanessa replied, glad that her husband at least addressed her directly. And why did she sleep with the general there? Is this also some kind of social norm for that country? Victor continued in a state of intoxication. I wish I knew the answers to all your questions, Vanessa whispered after a thoughtful pause. And tell me what social norm of our great country allowed you to share a body with your boss to bring him back from the world of the living dead? Victor asked loudly in his drunken state, the pain of betrayal ringing in his voice. Vanessa stared at her husband with wide eyes. Tears had already begun to fall from her eyes, red from crying. Victor, I'm sorry for the pain and suffering that I caused you. If I could go back in time and fix everything, I would do it. But Victor, we need to move forward, and I know that we can do it. By this point, Vanessa was sitting on her knees in front of him, resting her hands on his hips. Moving forward? Us? What do we have ahead of us that makes you sound so optimistic? Victor growled. Darling, we have spent our whole lives together. We have 2 beautiful children who are proof of our mutual love, and also our grandchildren. It is like a seedling that we have tended, watered it, fed it with fertilizers, and watched it grow. Now this tree has grown tall and strong and bears fruit, the fruits of our labor. Just think about all that lies ahead. In a sense, our life is just beginning. Some of my actions in the past seem to have hurt you greatly. Well, Victor, let's say I fell into bad company and became addicted to prohibited drugs, substances. Wouldn't you then try to hold me back and move forward in life? Victor's brain, soaked in alcohol, tried to find an answer. If his wife became a drug addict, what would he do? Would you yell at her? Would you scold her? Or would he try to help her get rid of her addiction and return to a normal life? So is she addicted to sex? Did she want something new? Is this what she was implying? So you admit that you are a horny nymphomaniac. How many men have you had in your life besides me and good old Harry? Victor, there were no other men in my life except you, Vanessa answered sharply. And I'm not a horny nymphomaniac. You know me well enough, and should have thought before throwing such cheap accusations at me, she continued with a hint of anger in her voice. That's the problem, Victor replied. The photos show you having sex with your boss. You yourself admit that you had an affair with your boss, and you continue to claim that there was no one in your life but me. Victor, I simply used my body to help a sick and mourning soul. I think I deserve a better judgment than the one you give. I need fresh air, Victor replied, irritated. He stood up and swayed towards the guest room, falling face down on the bed. The next morning, Victor woke up early with a pounding headache. The feeling of bloating in his stomach reminded him that he had barely eaten anything yesterday. He was surprised to see Vanessa sleeping in the chair next to his bed. Then the memories of yesterday's argument came back to him, and he felt sick. Yes, he really needed fresh air. In fact, he needed to be alone with his thoughts to try to figure out the best path forward. He looked again at the sleeping figure of his wife. An empty glass on the table next to her chair meant that she would sleep for a while longer. Victor quickly gathered a few things and other necessities into a sports bag and quietly left the house. He decided that he would spend a few days at their lake house. He deserved a break. He left a note in the kitchen for Vanessa, telling her where he would be. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.